tribute to tuna was produced not only in honor of the men who forged an industry from the sea, using cane poles, their bare hands, guts, and determination, but in honor of the magnificent fish they chased, the tuna. After traveling thousands of miles and spending months at sea, the feelings of entering San Diego Harbor and returning home to family and friends is an experience known to and treasured by only a few unique individuals. Those few who chose to forgo the securities of a 9-to-5 routine and instead chose to live their lives at sea, chasing tuna. With the arriving clippers' approach, the excitement and anticipation along the docks was electric. But along with all the cheering, celebration, and happiness, there was always a silent prayer of thanks upon everyone's lip for another safe return of the boat and her crew. After the initial welcome home hugs and kisses, it was time to get back to the all-important task of offloading thousands of pounds of fish that represented months' worth of work. The crews always offloaded their own catch, but occasionally a new kid would worm his way into talking a crew member into letting him help offload. And if he was real persistent and was always there to meet the boat every trip after trip, worked his butt off and then got real lucky, after a couple of years the old man might just let him ride as a quarter-share apprentice. The initial step in the canning process was removing the fish from the refrigerated wells. The wells were each capable of holding between 25 and 40 ton, and on average about 100 tons could be offloaded in a day. The fish were hoisted up and then dumped into the saltwater sloughs which ran along the docks and led directly to the cannery. Fish were then inspected, graded, and weighed before being transferred into saltwater thawing bins where they were slowly brought back to temperature. Once thawed, the fish were washed and the innards were removed and then sent to the reduction plant to be processed into pet food and fertilizer. No part of the fish was thrown out or wasted. To ensure proper cooking times, the tuna were inspected and racked according to their size and weight. Cooking times ranged anywhere from 1 to 10 hours at a preheated and precisely controlled and maintained temperature 218 degrees Fahrenheit. Each giant individual oven or cooker was capable of handling over 8,000 pounds of fish at a time. Once the initial cooking was completed, the steaming hot racks were then rolled from the cookers and left overnight in giant cooling rooms. Once cooled, the fish were then conveyed along seemingly endless rows of cleaning tables, where each fish was hand-cleaned and individually scraped, leaving only the choice loins and tender white meat for packing. Here the heads, skin, bones, and dark meat were removed and consigned to the reduction plant for processing. The prime loins were then prepared for the chopper, or what was called the guillotine, where the meat was cut up and prepared for chunk-style packing. The tuna was then hand-inspected for texture and quality prior to being placed into cans. The cans were then checked for weight and again hand-tested before a natural vegetable oil was added to help preserve the delicate taste and texture of the fish. Cans were then conveyed along in single file to be automatically capped and sealed at a rate of 5 cans per second. Once sealed, the cans were placed in huge wire baskets and rolled into giant retorts or pressure cookers, where the tuna, can and all, were recooked at a temperature of 214 degrees Fahrenheit for 80 minutes. This process eliminated any threat of contamination and assured that every can would be bacteria and germ-free. This one bank of retorts alone was capable of cooking over 250,000 cans of tuna an hour. After an overnight cooling, the cans were given a final inspection, weighed, checked for proper vacuum, and then dumped into the unscrambler, where they were gravity-fed into a labeling machine. Once labeled, the cans were then stacked into rows of 4 and automatically fed into the final packing and shipping cases at a rate of over 480 cans per minute. This single cannery, when operating at full capacity, could process on average 350,000 pounds of fish per day, which amounted to close to 700,000 cans of tuna every 24 hours. During the industry's peak years of the late 1940s and early 50s, there were 22 canneries operating full-time on American soil. Today, the last remaining cannery in the United States has been sold to developers and is slated for closure. The San Diego-based tuna industry was founded in 1903 and reached its peak in the early 1950s when a total of 275 tuna clippers were operating out of San Diego. The ultra-modern bait boats of the 50s represented state-of-the-art in marine engineering and cost upwards of $500,000 apiece. Many of these wooden boats were originally built for the Navy, as supply transport boats for the troops fighting in the Pacific during the Second World War and were known as YPs. After the war ended, they were sold as used surplus and were quickly and easily converted into bait boats. Ranging anywhere from 70 to 150 feet in length, powered with up to an 800 horsepower single diesel-driven Atlas or Union main, these clippers were the pride of the fleet and home to the men who spent months at sea fishing the Pacific. Preparation for the trip was carefully planned down to the last detail. Specially harvested, hand-cut Japanese cane was imported for use as lift poles because of its unique quality of being both incredibly strong while remaining light and flexible. Over 4 tons of rock salt were loaded aboard to create the brine. Over 50,000 gallons of diesel fuel and 4,000 gallons of fresh water were taken aboard. Water makers hadn't even been invented yet, so the boats had to rely on coastal wells and island springs for resupply. For example, at Cocos, which was known as a good water island, they towed the bait skiff under the waterfalls, let it fill up, and then tow it back to the clipper where the fresh water would be pumped aboard. Everything from medical supplies and movies to the crew's personal gear had to be planned out, brought aboard, checked, and then securely stored. For the crew of 12, the clipper would become home and the only safe refuge they know for the next 3 to 4 months. Venturing into the unknown, with no guarantees of success or even a safe return, it's a rare individual that chose to make his living at sea. Yet even though men have been doing so since the beginning of time, it's never easy bidding farewell to loved ones. The first order of business after departing San Diego was to find bait off the inner banks and shallows along the Mexican and Central American coast in places like Banderas Bay. Without the use of scanning sonars and high-tech electrical gear, the men of the 50s used knowledge that had been passed down from generation to generation. Relying on their own abilities, experience, and instinct, they knew how to read the water, read the birds to find out not only where the bait was, but the tuna as well. The clippers all carried their own speedboat, bait skiff, rowing skiff, net, and gear for making bait. The best bait was usually made at night, as it still is today. With over an acre of net to lay, the tides, currents, and an innate ability to read in which direction the bait was working were all critical factors in making a successful set. When the signal was given, the skiff was released and the net was laid out as the speedboat made the wrap and encircled the bait. Lead weights were used to hold down the bottom of the net, while cork floats were utilized to hold the upper portion above the surface. When set, a lamparo looks somewhat like a corral with large sections on the outside and a fine half-inch mesh in the middle known as a sack. Once set, the speedboat would tie the skiff off and keep a constant upcurrent pull on it to prevent the skiff from drifting down into the net and causing it to collapse. The net was then hauled back by hand into the skiff and stacked in preparation for the next set. The bait would always settle to the deepest part of the net and would sometimes take over an hour of hauling before they even knew if there'd been a successful wrap. With the ability to hold over 6,000 scoops, dozens of sets had to be made before a boat was plugged. With a successful wrap, the slow, delicate process of transferring the bait from the net to the boat began. Even though thousands of passes were made, every man that handled the bait did so with the utmost care. Each scoop was only filled to about a third of its capacity to avoid crushing and injuring the baits in the bottom of the scoop. The bait of choice was called anchoveta and was treasured for its hardy resilience and its ability to stay strong and healthy in the wells. Anchoveta are a deep-bellied brown bait, similar in characteristics to cavieta, only much smaller, averaging about 3 to 5 inches in length. Unlike anchovies or sardine, which often roll when transferred from their native habitat into warmer waters, anchoveta could easily withstand drastic changes in water temperature. In radio contact with a very select group of about 6 or 7 code boats, the skipper would get the latest information about an area, decide where he wanted to start fishing, and then lay down a course. With thousands of square miles of ocean, your code group was your lifeblood to success. A man's word was his honor, and code groups were held as sacredly as any religion. Instructions were relayed from the bridge to the engine room, where the chief engineer had full control over the machinery. Inline exposed rocker arms were standard built, primarily for their maintenance. Without sophisticated sat-nav technology and equipment, the skipper, like those who sailed the seas before him, relied on his sextant, the sun and the heavens, for precise navigation. Thin-walled and evenly tapered, extremely strong yet very flexible cane was needed to make lift poles. Therefore, only the finest, hand-selected northern Japanese cane was imported for the fleet by Taniguchi's. because only cane hardy enough to withstand the cold weather and extreme wind conditions of Japan's northern mountainous region had all the characteristics demanded of a good pole. Identical one-pole heavy sets could be snapped together with a pigtail, creating a two-pole set. Additional lines could also be spun into the theata, instantly creating 3- and 4-pole sets. Garwoods or Jap stars were the baits of choice, and each crewman made his own squids by wrapping 4/0 to 16/0 lead-headed, forged barbless hooks with white chicken feathers, tied securely in place with wax linen, and then covered with drumskin. Each guy had his own personal way of doing it and had his own personal touch to his squids. Northern Japanese cane grows to heights of over 150 feet, and with trunk diameters exceeding 3 feet, only the very tips or sprouts of the bamboo were cut and made into lift poles. The rough edges around the nodes were carefully filed down to keep your hands from getting torn up. Good poles were hard to come by, but until 1974, when skipper Herb Gale on the Dorsey introduced the first fiberglass lift poles, nothing could beat the even taper, flex, and strength of a good Japanese cane pole. Well-balanced nutritional meals were a must aboard ship. They were an integral part of the crew's daily routine, and everybody knows nothing hits the spot like a good old-fashioned steaming hot meal. Well, almost a hot meal. While the crew enjoys their gourmet dining, we're going to take a short break for a word from our sponsor, but we'll be right back with some of the most incredible lift pole footage ever filmed, so stay tuned.
And here is the prize of the fisherman, ready to become the most versatile performer in your kitchen. Which will it be, chunk style or solid pack?
Which will it be? Well, if you're planning to serve tuna salad, either the solid pack or the chunk style will be just right. Zesty tuna combined with lettuce and spinach or with carrots and beets. Simple to prepare and simply delicious. So is this tomato surprise, stuffed with tidbits of tuna and celery or green peppers. To prepare this tuna cream dip, use either the solid pack or chunk style. Most people prefer the chunk style combined with a little sour cream, horseradish, and onion salt. And for the party on the patio, or for that picnic in the park, don't forget the barbecued style of tuna dishes. The whole sandwich can be wrapped in foil and grilled, or the meat itself can be sizzled to a golden brown. And tuna is now available in a dietetic pack, prepared and canned under the most rigorous scientific control. And of course, strained tuna in special baby packs is considered highly beneficial for infant feeding. And what mother doesn't always insist on giving her baby only the best in nourishing food for healthy bodybuilding?
As with any kind of fishing, finding them is the key to catching them. Without hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of high-tech electrical wizardry on board, without infrared surface temperatures and other satellite data being constantly fed to the bridge, without scanning sonars, onboard helicopters, and without miles of net, the men who used to fish for tuna did so with an understanding of the sea and a knowledge of her ways that have been passed down from father to son, generation after generation. When the first fish were spotted, a chum line was laid as anchoveta were brailed off the corner. As the crew scrambled for the racks, the boat would run up swell of the school. With fish boiling in the chum line, everyone except the skipper, the engineer, and the bait man would grab a rig and go to work. As soon as the first squid hit the water, the